Okay, so power diagrams are what we do when we want to document where the electricity comes from and how we are going to distribute it correctly and safely across our system. Thus far in your life, the extent to which you've had to care about where electricity comes from is where is the nearest outlet, right? And that's fine. And there are a lot of people that have done a lot of work to make it that simple for you. And in your house, that's generally about all you have to worry about is where's the nearest outlet. Every once in a while, you might trip a breaker and be confused by that. And maybe you get as far as thinking, did I plug too many things in? Which can happen. But that doesn't happen very often. Generally speaking, residential electricity is pretty well figured out. Stuff is scaled such that it's pretty hard to overload a residential circuit these days. There's a lot of code that, electrical code that kind of like makes that very difficult for your average person that lives somewhere to have that kind of problem. However, when you're doing sound and putting a sound system in a space, now maybe if you're working in a space where somebody has, already done that work and they've just installed a sound system and it was done by a contractor, well, they will have done all this. They will have figured out where all the electricity comes from and how to distribute it correctly and how to make sure that you're not overloading anything. And therefore, in some cases, you may not have to care about it even in a performance venue if it has a system already there. But if you're putting the system in yourself, which is what we teach you guys how to do, you've got to think about this more than maybe you have ever before. And so before any of this will make any sense to you at all, I need to explain a little bit about how electricity works. And there's some terms that we're going to throw around a little bit that I want to make sure we understand what they mean. So, and to understand what they mean, I'm going to use an analogy that hopefully will make sense. So, imagine, if you will, that you are trying to push an enormous boulder some distance, okay? Big, huge rock. And you have decided, I'm going to push this big, huge rock and try to make it move to a new place, okay? And you're going to do it all by yourself, without any tools and equipment. Like you're just going to push it with your hands, okay? Well, to pull this off, you will need to have some energy available to do this, right? You will need to be well rested and, have, eaten your Wheaties that morning and have some energy available to do this. If you don't want to be wiped out and tired and sore and everything, that you will not have a whole lot of success pushing the rock. You're going to want to be well rested, well nourished, and in tip-top shape to do that, and therefore you will have a certain amount of energy stored within you available to make this happen. Okay, and that energy that is stored within you, that is available to make stuff happen, can be described as volts in electrical terms. Okay, so volts is potential energy that is sitting somewhere available to be used to do something with. Okay, that's volts. And then you're gonna push against this rock, right? You're gonna stick your hands on the rock and you're gonna push on it and try to use some of this energy that you have to push it. Well, the rock is gonna push back a little bit, or maybe a lot, depending on how big it is compared to how big you are and how much energy you have. But the rock is gonna push back a certain amount. In other words, it is going to resist your efforts to push it because it's heavy and it doesn't want to be pushed, and because gravity is slowing it down, right? And that gravity that will be, in play there will resist your efforts. A bigger rock is going to resist more than a smaller rock, right? Just because a bigger rock is heavier and being affected more by gravity. So, gravity's impact on it is, yes, that's probably a better way to say it. Gravity is not really a variable, is it? Yeah. So, but anyway, that rock will resist your efforts to some extent, and we can describe the amount that it resists as impedance. Okay. So it's going to impede your effort to some extent because of gravity. Okay. And so that combination of the energy you have in you that is available to be used, volts, up against the amount that the rock is impeding your efforts, you will be able to push that rock a certain amount or not. Okay? But the amount that you are able to push it, or how far you're able to push it, that would be the work you're able to perform. I was able to push it a foot, or I was able to push it 10 feet, or I was able to push it 100 feet. Okay? And we would describe that, the result of your effort as work, the work that you accomplished, and in electrical terms, that's watts. Okay, watts is the work that got accomplished when you coupled the potential energy in volts and the impedance in ohms. You put those two things together, and some amount of work or none will get done. And the amount of work or none that gets done is usually described in watts. It moved this much, or I did this many watts worth of work as a result. Okay. Now here there is a significant problem with this situation, which is that just because you have that certain amount of energy within you, you have to be able to channel that energy through your arms into your hands to do all that work, right? Well, how much energy do your arms have the capacity to deal with, right? I mean, some people have, really big muscular arms, that can store, channel a whole lot of energy, right? Somebody who's really been working out is going to be able to stick a lot of their potential energy into those arms in order to try to do this work. Somebody who has very weak arms and that muscles aren't as big is not going to be able to put as much energy through those arms. So they might have plenty of energy inside of them, but there's only so much of that can go through their arms, right? And the amount of energy that is able to channel through those arms at a time, that can be described in electrical terms as current. Okay? So somebody who is able to, the person with the really big muscles is going to be able to channel more current through those arms than the person with small muscles and weak arms, right? They're not going to be able to put as much of that energy through their arms at a time. So low current, as opposed to big muscles, high current, okay? And the issue there is if you try to put more of that energy through your arms than your muscles will allow, what's going to happen? You could break your arms, right? That would be the really catastrophic piece of it, right? You could break your arms, but hopefully something else happens before that. Before your arms break, what might happen that would be a little less disastrous?
You stop pushing?
Yeah, it might hurt, right? you might have some pain, or your muscles might just sort of like get a cramp or something. But there will be some sort of defense mechanisms that will go into place in your body that will say, hey, wait a minute, bad idea, right? Something's going to hurt. And you're going to go, I think I need help or whatever, right? Because, yeah, if you keep doing that, eventually you'll just break something, okay? And your body has all kinds of defense mechanisms to stop you from doing that. That's what pain really is about. Pain is just a warning signal to you, like, hey, maybe stop what you're doing, or hey, something's wrong. and you should really look into that because this is not heading in a direction that is very safe for you, okay? And so in electrical terms, those are called breakers or fuses, right? So in electrical circuits, you build in little things into the circuit that are easy to, that essentially have built-in breaking points that are not very catastrophic. So in an electrical wire, if you put too much current through it, it catches on fire, all right? Because it just gets so hot, because that's what happens. Once you exceed the amount of current that it can handle, the rest of the energy you try to put in it just turns into heat, okay? And it just turns the rest of it into heat. You keep pumping it into there, it just gets hotter, and eventually it catches itself and or things around it on fire because it got so hot. Well, we really don't want that to happen. We don't want your house to burn down, or you don't want the theater to burn down because you tried to cram more current into the wire than you should have. And so a good electrician who is following proper electrical code is going to build in some breakers or fuses into that circuit where that wire is that says, hey, before you could ever get to that point where you're putting more current through that wire than it can handle, it's gonna stop you, right? And that breaker is just like, hey, if it ever exceeds this much current, which is measured in amps, okay, just turn it off, okay? And in the olden times, fuses were much more common. Fuses still exist in like little pieces of equipment, still tend to have fuses. In building electrical systems, it tends to be breakers, because the thing with fuses is a fuse is this little wire that is designed to explode, like literally explode, when a certain amount of amps goes through it, and it just like blows up, and it's contained inside of usually glass or something, so that when it explodes, it doesn't catch anything on fire around it. It just sort of like blows up, and no more electricity is allowed to flow through that thing. And that's how we stopped that circuit from letting more current go into the wire. Okay, is a fuse. Yeah.
A fuse?
It's called a fuse. Yeah. And so it used to be that you had those in your house. So instead of a breaker panel with a bunch of switches, you literally had a bunch of these fuses, and you would blow it up, and you would have no electricity. And you'd have to go out there and literally replace a fuse. You'd have to like unscrew this thing. And most people would have a little box of fuses, there in their house. And you'd have to get one out of the right size and screw it back in there so that you now have a wire in there again, and electricity can go through. But if you are out of that particular fuse, you can't fix it until you go to the store and buy another fuse. So now we have a little bit more graceful ways of dealing with that, which is we have these mechanical things called breakers, which is a switch that you can turn it on, and it's kind of spring-loaded. And there's inside of there, it knows that when a certain amount of current is reached, if it ever exceeds 15 amps or 20 amps or something, it's like, whoa, and that spring releases, and the breaker turns off, just turns the switch off and stops it before it gets too hot, okay? So those are the important terms that you need that you want to think about when we're talking about power. So we care about where does the electricity come from, right? Where is that potential energy? Where is that stored somewhere? Where can I get it from so that I can use it to push the rock? And the rock in this case is usually the loudspeaker, right? The loudspeaker is the rock that you're trying to push. It's literally this heavy thing you're trying to push back and forth, okay? And you're going to use a lot of technology strung together to do that, but that's the end result is you're pushing a loudspeaker, okay? And the loudspeaker has an impedance, and that impedance, goes up against the power amplifier, and that relationship between the energy that the power amplifier is able to put out, or has available to put out, coupled with the impedance that the loudspeaker puts on it, determines the watts. So using just watts to describe a loudspeaker is woefully incomplete way of describing what that thing can do, because it depends, right? The actual watts that loudspeaker does, or the work that gets done by the loudspeaker, depends on that power amplifier, what it can do against that impedance. But whatever that power amplifier can do against that impedance is going to require a certain amount of current flowing through the wires at any given time in order to make that happen. And you better make sure that the wires and the whole circuit is able to handle that much current, that many amps, right? It has to be able to handle that much current flowing through it without tripping the breaker. So you don't have to worry about catching the building on fire usually. You just have to worry about the breaker switching off in the middle of your show. Because if you trip the breaker in the middle of the show, no sound for you, right? I mean, you got to like stop and go down to the basement or something and find the breaker panel and switch everything back on. And then figure out what went wrong. Because if you don't figure out what went wrong, it's just going to trip again the second you start going, because you're trying to pull too much current through that circuit in order to push that loudspeaker. So that's what we're trying to do with the power diagram, is those two things. It shows us where is the energy coming from and where are all the breakers in that chain. So usually in a building, you're going to have this thing called a transformer. And the transformer is the thing that is the piece of technology between the power company and you, okay? And it's usually sitting right outside the building somewhere. Sometimes inside the building, but usually the main one is outside the building. You don't get to access that, right? That's not something you have any control over. If there's something goes wrong with that, you got to call the power company. But it's sitting there somewhere, and that's what is. And the power company has appropriately sized that thing to be able to deliver the amount of energy that your building requires. Okay. And then it's going to take that, and maybe that then shows up inside of your building on some electrical panel somewhere with some big, huge breaker, right? Could be like 4,000 amps or something, right? So we could pull 4,000 amps worth of current through that breaker that feeds the whole building. Okay, that's a lot. And there's going to be really thick wires coming between that transformer and that breaker. I mean, like this big. Okay, so it can handle all that current without blowing up and catching on fire. Okay, and then what it's going to do is it's going to subdivide that. It's going to say, okay, well, we got 4,000 amps in the building, and we're going to create a branch off of that that is 100 amps that goes this way, 100 amps available over here, 200 amps that goes this way, a couple hundred amps that goes this way, and it's this little tree that branches off, and that 100 amp little thing that goes this way is going to be another panel that has a 100 amp breaker on it, okay? And then inside that panel is going to be a whole bunch of smaller breakers, right? So in that 100 amp panel, you're going to have, okay, a 15 amp here, and 15 amps there, 20 amps here, so on and so until you get to 100, okay? And generally speaking, they go more than that, right? You're going to have more, it's not going to be the sum total of the breaking capacity of each individual breaker is not going to equal 100 amps. It's going to be more than that. The theory is that you're not ever going to be pulling the full capacity of every single breaker in that panel. You're probably not going to do that. And part of the reason for that is that those individual breakers are hopefully going to start tripping. When you start pulling more, you're never going to see that full 100 amps, hopefully. Okay, but you'll have more potential for current than the 100 amp in that panel. Okay, and so it's unlikely that panel is going to trip, but it's possible. I mean, it certainly has the ability for that 100 amp breaker to trip, but that's probably not going to happen, because what's going to happen first is those smaller breakers are going to start tripping, right? Those 15 amp breakers or 20 amp breakers will start tripping first, long before you get to 100 to trip the whole panel. Okay, so inside that panel, you'll have 15 amp here, 15 amp, 15 amp, 20 amp, 30 amp, whatever, and those go to the actual, receptacles on the wall, right? So when you plug into a receptacle on a wall, on the other end of that, that wire is probably a breaker that is either 15 amps or 20 amps. If it's in your house, it's probably 15 amps. If it's in a building like a theater, it's probably 20 amps. Okay, what you have to do is make sure, because you could, you have things that you put in your racks like power conditioners and stuff that turn one receptacle into many, so that you can plug lots of things into that one little thing on the wall. What you have to make sure is that you don't plug so many things into that one little receptacle on the wall that is fed by that one little 20 amp breaker, that you don't plug so many things in there that you start pulling more than 20 amps of current. Because if you do that, then what happens? That switch will shut itself off, and whatever that whole big like daisy chain full of power conditioners that you came up with to plug everything in, none of that's going to have any power at all, because the breaker's going to trip in the panel, and everything in that rack is going to go down. And that's on purpose. It's to protect you and everyone in the building from fire. Okay, and that's, theaters and fire do not mix. Okay, if history has told us anything, it's that theaters and fire do not go well together, and so it's to protect you. You don't want to do anything to circumvent that protection system. Okay, I've seen people do that before, and that's a super bad idea. Okay, I know the breaker's tripping. Tape it open, or I think there's another breaker here in the drawer. I could just pop a bigger breaker in here, then it won't trip. It's like, wait a minute. That breaker was put there for a reason. It was put there because the wires that are hooked up to it can only handle so much current before they catch on fire. You could go and put a 30 amp breaker into that 15 amp slot, but that means that the breaker won't shut off before that wire that is rated at 15 amps gets too hot, right? So you should not be making efforts to circumvent that, okay? Don't do that. You need to change what you're doing. No, don't change what the circuit is capable of, okay? Because that requires pulling new wire, getting an electrical contractor involved, getting a state inspector to come in and make sure that it was all done right. Because generally, the government regulates this stuff, because the government pays for the fire company to put out the fire. And so the best way to afford to pay for the fires is to make sure the fires never happen. That's the cheapest way. Cheapest way to deal with things catching on fire is to make sure the fires never happen. And so the state will sink most of their money into making sure the fires never happen. So they will regulate this, and they will make sure that when this is all installed, that it's all fine, and that it's likely we're never going to get to the place where those wires catch on fire. Okay. Everybody with me so far? Any questions? You understand the basic principles here? All right. So let me show you now what you're going to draw. So here are the kinds of things that you might need to care about when you are making a thing like a power diagram. So you'll have a piece of equipment, right? A piece of technology that requires electricity to operate. And so I've just made a little box, and it has a little label for it, for the type of equipment it is. Just what is it? Is it a power amplifier? Is it a mixer? Is it a, what is it? Computer? Just what is it? Something that you could describe it so you'll know what it is. And you could even put some more details like a make and model. So if it's like a computer, you could say, well, it's an Apple Mac Mini or something. Or if it's a mixing console, okay, it's a, Allen & Heath SQ5. Right? Well, to do its thing, it is going to draw a certain amount of amps in worth of current through the electrical circuit in order to do the work that it needs to do. It will require a certain amount of amps. And that is a bit of a moving target, right? Depends on what you ask it to do. If all you're asking it to do is to sit there idle, just turn it on and sit there with none of the circuits really doing much, that's not going to require a lot of current, is it? Okay, but if you actually start telling it to do a lot of things, like if it's a mixing console, and you say, okay, mixing console, okay, here's now a bunch of sounds that you have to amplify and make louder and mix together and then shoot out the other end, with higher voltage, well, it's going to use some current to do that, okay? And so depending on what you ask it to do, the number of amps that that little piece of equipment pulls off of that circuit is going to be different. What you want to do, for purposes of making sure that you don't trip the breakers, you want to find out what's the worst case scenario here. If I crank this thing up to 11 and say, do all the things at the most possible way that you could do all those things. What is the most possible way that you could do all those things? And if that was happening, how many amps would it be drawing off that circuit? That's the number you want to put in there. Generally speaking, it pulls the most amount of current when you first turn it on. Because when you first turn something on, all of that circuit is like, okay, I gotta get ready. I don't know what they're gonna ask me to do, but I gotta get ready. And it's got a bunch of capacitors usually. Capacitors are all over the place in electronics. And capacitors store energy. And those capacitors are gonna initially just kind of go, give me all the energy. And they're gonna charge themselves up so they're ready to do all the work. And that's a lot of stuff that's a lot of current that is required really quickly right away to charge up all those capacitors and get that electrical circuit ready to go. So generally speaking, most equipment draws the most current when you first turn it on. And so if you can't find out from like the manual or something, or sometimes it'll tell you on the back of it how many amps it'll pull at the most. Sometimes the manual will tell you, sometimes you gotta like ask. Sometimes it'll tell you something like, well, it's got a power supply that is like a 300 watt power supply or something like that. And you know that this is a 120 volt, circuit. And so there's math you can do to figure out how many amps that would be, right? So if they say it's a 300 watt power supply and you know it's a 120 volt circuit, how many amps would that be? Well, watts equals volts times amps, okay? And so that means amps would equal watts divided by volts. So 300 watts divided by 120 volts is 2.5 amps, okay? So, all right, that's probably worst case scenario. Assuming that the specs are telling you accurate information, which hopefully they do. Sometimes they don't, though. Yes?
What was that equation you said?
Watts equals volts times amps. Therefore, the algebraically inclined could conclude that amps equals watts divided by volts. The way you remember that is it's West Virginia. That's how I remember it. W equals VA, right? West Virginia. And then algebra, which I'm not very good at, but algebra tells you that you could wiggle all that stuff around and invert that equation to get you other things. Okay, so if you remember that first part, you could use algebra to figure out the other permutations of that. Okay, so that's usually the easiest way to figure it out. But it's about the power supplies. A lot of people get confused with power amps because power amplifiers will also be specified in watts, but the watts is like the output of the amplifier, and that's against a certain impedance, and that's not what you're looking at. You're looking at the power supply for that amplifier. How many watts can it do? Is it capable of? And that gets you the current. So anyway, you want to put the number of amps that is the worst case scenario. And if you just can't figure that out, if there's no specs for it and you can't do the math or whatever, there are tools that let you figure that out. You could, if you've got a multimeter that is capable of like handling the amount of current you think is potential in there, then you could hook that up and do that. But we've got a little thing called a kilowatt, which is just a little gizmo you plug into the wall, and then you plug your equipment into that, and you can set it to watts or amps or volts or whatever, and you set it to amps, and then you turn the thing on and make it do its worst, right? Do all the things at the most possible way, and the little kilowatt will tell you how many amps is coming through it when that happens, and that can tell you. So this is the basic thing: is a piece of equipment that has a description and has a certain amount of amps that it pulls off of the circuit if it's doing all of the things in the most possible way. Okay? And then these little things describe basically receptacles. Okay, the little things on the wall that have the energy theoretically available. Okay, so a single plex is a thing on the wall that has one little Edison receptacle on it. Okay, a duplex is a thing on the wall that has two Edison receptacles on it. That's what you see most of. Most of the time you're talking about a duplex. A fourplex is like a quad box, right? Where you've got four of those Edison receptacles on a wall and or maybe sometimes even on a little box that's on the end of a cable. Although fire marshals hate that. They don't like that a lot. And then, those are the things that are most common that you're going to see. And then you've got this one, which is, I've just called special, which is like anything that's not those three things, okay? So there's a lot of like twist lock kind of things, or things that can handle higher voltage or higher current, or both, and those would be kind of special things. Like a power con, for example, could be a special. Anything that's not a singleplex, duplex, or fourplex Edison, you would just use this special. Now, I did not make up these symbols. So these symbols come from, there's electricians sort of have symbols for this kind of stuff when they make these kind of drawings. We are kind of adapting some actual standards in electrical drawings, adapting them to simplify them for our needs. Okay, so that's what that is. Now, this is represents the symbol used for the actual circuit breaker. And what this is showing you is, okay, we've got electricity on a wire, and then there's some sort of terminal there, and then there's another little terminal where the wire continues, and I'm putting in this other wire in between them. This is essentially diagramming a fuse, okay? So the little green wire is representing the delicate wire that's in the fuse that is designed to explode when a certain amount of current goes through it. And then it will have the ID, that's like, oh, I need to get this back in. There you go. Okay, so the ID that's like if you open up the breaker panel, all the little breakers usually have numbers on them. So it's whatever it's labeled on the breaker panels, which you want to put there. And then you want to say, okay, what is the maximum number of amps? Which is basically the breaking capacity. Is this 15 amp breaker, 20 amp breaker, 30 amp breaker, 100 amp breaker, 4,000 amp breaker? What is it? How many amps before this thing shuts itself off? And then underneath of that, you say, here's how many amps I think I'm going to use based on all the things I'm plugging in and what I know about them. So you hopefully want the number of amps used to be a smaller number than the maximum number of amps of the system. If it's the other way, if you're using more amps than the maximum, then you're likely to trip that breaker, and you don't want that to happen. Everybody with me so far? We okay? Is this making sense? Okay. So that's what that symbol is. This is the symbol for a switch, which you will encounter sometimes. If things have switches on them, like the most common example of this is like a power conditioner that you would put in a rack. Usually those have switches on them so you can shut down the whole rack. If that switch is off, then nothing in that rack will have electricity in it, right? So it would be nice for you to know that that switch exists, okay? So that you know that it has to be on. So that's why you put it in the drawing. So, hey, there's a potential place here where I would lose my electricity, even if everything is technically turned on. Like you could have, like let's say you're building an amplifier rack, and you have a power conditioner at the top of that or something like that. Well, all the amplifiers could technically be turned on, but if the power conditioner switch is turned off, then no power for you, right? So you want to know about that. So this is a switch. This is a symbol for what we would call a lamp. And a lamp, or it's like a light bulb or something. And sometimes power conditioners in particular sometimes have lights in them. Little lights you can pull out so you can it'll light up all the equipment below it. Well, that's going to draw a little bit of current, that lamp, okay? And that's additional current than all of the equipment you have plugged in. It's not going to be very much, but you should be aware of it so that you're including it in your calculation. It's not going to be a lot, but less than an amp for sure. And then there's this thing which we call the splice, which is just a dot representing wire touching wire, copper touching copper. And when copper touches copper, electricity can flow. Okay, so we just use that to show that. Okay, so those are the symbols that you're going to need to draw, okay, for this assignment. And you're just going to want to add these to your template, right? Here's your template file, right? And I'm just going to add those symbols in. So I've got those available to me. And then you are going to draw this power diagram. Okay, so let me walk you through this and show you what we're talking about here. So I'm going to start at the top. Well, at the top here is some source of energy that I do not have access to. Okay? This electricity comes from somewhere, maybe in the building, or maybe outside the building, but either way, it's either in a closet that you don't have access to, or it's outside of the building and you have to call the power company to get it. So that's where your diagram begins, usually, is the unknown source of energy that you sort of assume is there because, you know, you can plug things into walls and there's electricity there. So somewhere there is a thing that is providing that energy. So that you always start there. I don't know, but I think it's there. Okay? And then you draw the things that you know. So this thing that you know, that you assume is there, provides a certain amount of energy. And you have this horizontal line that is essentially, you know, I would call this the voltage rail, or the hot, right? This is the electricity that comes off of that thing. And there's a little dot coming off of the source of energy saying, okay, copper touching copper. The copper is touching from the thing that I don't know where it is, but I assume is there. The copper touches this voltage rail, and therefore its potential energy is available. And then I've got two other things touching that same copper. One of them is this, which is a breaker, and I know it because I've used the symbol for a breaker. And I have the word amp racks next to that breaker, and that should mean that the actual breaker in the panel has a label on it, and that label is amp racks. Okay? And I'm saying that is a 400 amp breaker. 400 amps, that's a lot. But that's, you'll see that. You will see that in performance venues. You're not going to see that at your house. At your house, the most you're probably going to see is 100, maybe 200. If you can find that. So, you know, sometimes that's hidden from you. But your house probably has a 200 amp breaker, but the most you might actually ever put your eyes on is the 100 amp. Because that's usually what they put in a panel, in a sub panel is the most that put is 100 amps. But you probably have a 200 amp. But in a big performance venue, you could 400 amps, yeah, sure. See that all the time. And I've done all my work, and I think that I'm going to pull 154.12 amps off of this thing. I don't know what the 0.0 is. That's nothing. 154.12. That's how much I think I'm going to use. Well, that's less than 400, so I'm okay. However, I have this note here saying there is a bunch of other stuff from another space that also goes through this circuit, and I'm not involved in that. And therefore, I don't know how much is going to come off of that, but that's theoretically there. And there is what's called a 100 amp service disconnect, and that's like there's like a company switch or a sub panel somewhere where we could tie in another power distribution, and right, and that is off of this as well. I'm not using that, but I'm just acknowledging that it's there. Potentially, someone could walk in the building and, you know, tie in a bunch of feeder cable into that company switch on the stage and pull 100 amps off this thing. I'm not doing that. Somebody could, though. So I certainly want to make sure that whatever I'm using is 100 amps less than the max for sure, just because I know somebody could come and do that. and I want to make sure I'm leaving a bunch for this other rack that I'm not using. So I'm looking at that and I go, okay, well, if I count the 100 amp disconnect, that leaves 300 left, and of the 300 left, I'm only using approximately half of that. And therefore, this other rack in the other space could be using the other half, and we'd be okay. So that way, when that other space shows up, you say, hey, by the way, I think you've got 150 amps to work with. Right? And then you trust that they're going to do their job and figure out that stuff. Okay, so that amp racks breaker feeds another panel. And I'm just like, panel is just this box that I've drawn that contains a bunch of other breakers. So again, copper touches copper to a new voltage rail, and I have these 3 breakers, which are 40 amp breakers. So they 40 amp max, but I have this little dotted line drawn between them to show that this is 3 breakers that are tied together. And they can be tied together in a couple of different ways. The simplest way could be that they could literally just have a piece of plastic snapped onto them so that if one of them moves, all of them must move. Okay? Or sometimes this could be what's called a 3-phase breaker, where you would have a single switch, and by manipulating the phase of the power, which is not something I really want to talk about right now, it could have 3 different ways that the current could go through there in 3 different phases, and therefore, you could create 3 separate 40 amp circuits off of that are offset in phase, and it just gets you. The basic idea is we're dealing with sine waves here, and sine waves, if you're talking about a 40 amp sine wave, well, how often is it actually at 40 amps? Hardly ever, actually, right? It's only at the peak of that sine wave that it's at the 40 amps. The rest of the time, it's somewhere less than that. And so, you can create phase offsets in such a way that it's like, oh, well, I can make sure that the times I'm only at hardly ever at 40 are not ever happening at the same time, and I could create up to 3 different phases that would mean I would never actually be at 40 more than once, right? It's a clever little trick. It's called 3-phase power. So you could have a breaker that was working that way, that would theoretically have 3 things coming off of it, but it would be 1 switch. Yes?
Those usually, they're wider.
Yeah.
They usually occupy 3 spaces.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Just it's 1 switch. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So that would be a really big breaker in that panel,
Right.
much bigger than the 40 amp singles, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that it's the same thing.
Yeah.
That I'm thinking of the right.
Yep.
The right thing.
Yeah, that's what that would look like. In fact. All right. Good luck. All right. So the little dotted line that I'm drawing here between those three is just meant to represent, hey, these are together. Even though they separately have their own braking capacity, if one of them goes, all three of them go. Right? It's not possible for one to trip without tripping the others with it. Okay, that's what that little dotted line means. And that feeds this little thing called this Furman ASD 120 is a piece of equipment that's like it's a power sequencer. And the concept behind a power sequencer is that, remember when I said that things tend to draw the most current when you switch them on? So what this does is you could have a lot of things hooked up to this thing. The power sequencer looks like just a power strip or a power conditioner. But each receptacle doesn't turn on at the same time. So you hit a little button and it starts turning each one on. It'll turn the first one on, wait a little bit, then it'll turn the next one on, wait a minute, then it'll turn the next one on. And the idea is that you could theoretically have higher peak capacity than what the whole circuit could actually tolerate, but you're never actually going to turn everything on all at the same time, and therefore the combined peak capacity will never be reached. Okay? Because I'm never going to turn everything on at the exact same time. And so when I turn them on, that they pull the most. And so that's what this thing is. It's got 6 little branches for sequence. So it goes A turns on, waits a second, then B turns on, waits a second, then C turns on, waits a second, D, E, F. And it turns out that in this case, we really only have 3 breakers feeding this thing. So it does A and D are together, B and E are together, and C and F are together. So it goes A, waits a second, B, waits a second, C, waits a second, and then when it does D, D is turning on back at this first part, right? Because by then, A will have calmed down, and now hopefully, and now we can turn D on and get its big suck, without tripping the whole thing. Okay, so that's how this is wired. So I've got them labeled out of sequence, and that's why. But each of those branches, A has a 20 amp fuse or breaker on it, and D has a 20 amp fuse or breaker on it, but they are fed by a combined 40 amp breaker. So we could theoretically turn them both on at the same time, and we should still be okay. It would, right? We probably don't want to do that, but we could. In most situations, we probably could, and it would be okay. But we're going to be fine because I did my math here, and A is only pulling 2.5 amps, 2.7 amps, worst case scenario, and D is only pulling 16 amps, worst case scenario. Okay? And I figured that out because of this. So A feeds a switch. So this allows me to power the whole thing on and off. And from there, I have 2 things plugged into it. One is a Clearcom power supply, and the other is an auto mixer from Electrosonics. Power supply from Clearcom pulls 1 amp. The auto mixer pulls 1.7 amps. Together, that's only 2.7 amps on a 20 amp max. I've got tons of headroom there. But then I got this big power amplifier that's going to drive loudspeaker. Well, that sucker could pull as much as 16 amps if I had it do all the things at the most. Okay, it's theoretically capable of 16 amps. It's a big amplifier. Okay, well, that's still less than 20, so I'm fine, right? That's why I only have 1 of them on there. I'm not going to put 2 of those on there because that would be 32 amps, and that would trip that 20 amp breaker. Okay, so however, 16 plus 2.7 is only 18.7, and that's still way less than 40, so I'm good. Highly unlikely that breaker is going to trip. Theoretically impossible for that breaker to trip. But impossible is a very dangerous word. So now I've got B, and if I sum these 2 together, it's 17 amps on 20, that's fine. 16 amps on 20 over here, that's fine. and then I got C and F, and I got 16, and I got this one's an even bigger amp, a Macrotech 2400, which if it does all the things mostly, it could do 17 amps. Well, that's a lot. Okay, but it's still less than 20, so I'm good. And each of these is plugged into a singleplex, right? A single Edison receptacle. And wire touches wire, goes through the switch, goes through the breaker. Wire touches wire again, goes through that, up to the big breaker. From there, gets onto the big voltage rail that feeds from the 400 amp breaker, which feeds from the thing that I don't have access to, but I assume is there. Okay, questions about this? Is everybody with me on this? So someday you're going to have to be the one who figures this out. But today is not that day. Today is the day where you just draw this. Okay? And so if you look at the assignment says, power diagram assignment, it just says draw this and then draw this. Okay? So I would suggest saving that image and in a way that you can download it and then open it up and zoom in on it so you can see the detail. Okay? There. Now you can kind of go in and look at it more closely. But you're going to first draw the symbols and put those in your template, so all you're doing is copying, right? You're not drawing each of these things over and over again. So draw the symbols once and then never draw them again. A little word to the wise. Be very careful about relative scale for these symbols. Pay attention to that in my example here. How big these things are relative to each other. Because if you get that scale off too much, when you start putting this thing together, it's going to get weird really quick. If like your equipment boxes are too big, then these things become too tiny. So it just becomes hard to read and hard to fit. So I don't need you to plot this to PDF or anything, but just make this. Make this and turn it into ZDWG. Okay? Questions about this? Anything in here that you see that you're like, I don't know how to make that?
There's a command for arc. Would that be the command for?
Ah, excellent question.
You have to do a circle and then triplets.
Well,
I know you could do that.
yeah, there's a few ways. So yeah, let me show you. I'm going to do this circuit breaker. I will show you how I would draw that. So I would start by doing a line that is, I don't know, that long. And then I do a circle that is that big. And then I would draw myself a new line from here to however big I wanted this to be. I will say, what is it, maybe 0.75 based on my scale. And this has just become a thing for mirroring. So now I can take those things, I can mirror against that midpoint. There you go. And I'm going to ultimately delete this line in a second, okay? And then I'm going to go to this other layer because I want this line to be different. And yes, you could use a command called arc. And it says specify the start point of the arc. Well, the start point is there. Specify the second point of the arc or center/end. I want end. So E for end. It's going to start there. It's going to end here. And then it says, now specify the center point, right? And so I would just, this is just kind of like, well, you know, I would actually hold down Control to switch direction.
Go to the center point of your line.
Yep, go to the center point there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this. Because if you look at the way I've drawn it over here, it's probably actually a little bit bigger than that. Right? So let me just try a different one, and I'm going to say, I'm going to start it there and end it there. And then oh wait, hang on, I did that wrong. Arc, start point is there, end point is there, and then I can do that. That would give me a little bit bigger radius, okay? And then I'm just gonna, you could set up a trim line or something about there-ish, and say the crossing is that. Oops, that was wrong. That's fine. But you get the idea.
Yeah.
Get rid of that, and maybe that's not what, and get rid of that. Something like that, right? The other option is, if the arc is something like freaks you out, you can just do a circle. I'm going to do a tan radius. So I'm going to do the T for tangent, and the first tangent would be here off of that circle. The second tangent would be here off of that circle. And then I can specify the radius of it, which, would be something like that. Right, and then I can just kind of move this. Well, first I could trim, right? And this will be a cutting edge, that'll be a cutting edge, and then I can get that, and then offset. Okay, and at that point I can delete that. And I'll ultimately want to trim out that, and then I can hatch.
Those ones aren't hatched, are they?
Oh no, they're not. Yeah, you're right. It's only this one that would get hatched. So there's a few different ways to get that little curved line. Those are 2 ways. There's probably 3 or 4 others you can come up with if I thought about it long enough. But you can decide how you want to do it. Other questions? Anything else you see here that you're not sure how to make? Okay. Well, then you can get started. So I spent a lot of time talking about what the drawing means, but I don't need you to figure out this right now. I just need you to draw this thing that I drew, okay? Just draw that. Hopefully you understand what it means based on what I've just explained to you, but if you don't, that's fine. I'm not grading you on your ability to understand what the drawing means right now. I'm just grading you on your ability to draw that thing. Because that is what you will do first. In production, you would just be somebody who is not necessarily creating this drawing, but you would be helping with this drawing, right? You would be updating it, making changes and stuff like that. So you need to understand enough about how to make it so that if someone hands you one of these, you could tweak it, and you would know how to, they would say, oh, change this or change that or move this around. You can do that much. When you become an A1, you'll be the one figuring out what needs to be drawn. And that there will be other opportunities to learn about that. But I've given you the teaser on that today. Okay, any other questions? All right.